Cobra Kai, now streaming on Netflix, by the way. For those of you that don't know, seasons 1 and 2 of Cobra Kai were YouTube originals. They were produced by YouTube Red, and the show became fairly popular, and now Netflix purchased it from YouTube Red. So you can see the original season 1 as well as season 2 on Netflix, and season 3 premiered on Netflix, which is pretty dope, especially for not just for the fans, but the cast and crew. I would imagine because Netflix is such a wider distributed platform than YouTube's fairly new premium option. Like YouTube itself is obviously ubiquitous, right? It's everywhere. But the YouTube Red, a lot of people, because of the show Cobra Kai, paid for the subscription or got like the free trial of the subscription to watch the show, and then either canceled after the free trial or after they finished binge watching the show. So I would imagine that being on Netflix, they have a lot of a wider reach. But anyways, a bunch of writing credits to give on this series. So I'm just going to rattle off the names, starting with Jason Belville, Bob Theerden, Alyssa Forlater, Mattia Green, Stacey Harmon, Josh Heald, John Hurwitz, Robert Mark Kamen, Kevin McManus, Matthew McManus, Joe Pierulli, Hayden Schlossberg, Michael Jonathan Smith, and Luann Thomas. Shout out to all the writers. So this show, for me and for many folks, obviously checks off the nostalgia box. I've covered seasons 1 and 2 on previous episodes of the Spun Today Podcast. Feel free to go back and check them out. And I enjoyed the first couple seasons. The second even more than the first. Actually, I might be lying. I think the first one was pretty dope. Maybe I like them like equally, but they're like blurring in my memory right now. But I definitely liked the third season so far most of all, because they've been, in my opinion, what my only criticism, or one of my criticisms for seasons 1 and 2 is that although it checked off the nostalgia box, and from a creative storytelling perspective, it's a really dope way to enter the world of the Karate Kid from a different perspective. And for those of you that don't know and don't watch the show, they pretty much start off the series from the perspective of Johnny, which was the quote-unquote bully from the movies in Karate Kid, at least in part 1. They enter this story with telling more of his origin story and the events that happened in the movies from his perspective, and he becomes the person that you're rooting for, and then you see him as not being a bully, but being a kid that grew up without his dad, and then had a stepfather that treated him like shit, and he had this sick, twisted mentor in his sensei Kreese, which we learn a lot more about in this season in terms of his background and origin story. And in terms of his girlfriend, Allie, which is the girl that Daniel LaRusso, who's the new kid that comes to town, winds up, taking from him pretty much. It's not that he was such a dick to Allie. He was in love with her and just had, disagreements and, fights or whatever that you have as a couple, especially in like high school days and shit like that. And during one of those disagreements, this new kid, swoops in and like stole this girl pretty much. You know what I mean? So you start like feeling for the guy. Anyway, that was like super creative way of storytelling. So aside from those things that I love about the show, one of my biggest criticisms is that certain things were a little like on the nose and a little like corny. And I feel that here in the third season, although you still have sprinkles of that like throughout, like cheesy, corny, it's not as heavy-handed as it has been in seasons past. And obviously during a season 3 of a show, you're playing more with like character development and going deeper into the characters and learning more about them, especially from this new angle that we're viewing the world of the Karate Kid from. And that's obviously a bunch of fun. So the season 2 left off with, this like epic fight in the school between the two rival dojos. And Miguel, one of the main characters of the show, falls off a balcony or gets kicked off a balcony by Robbie and falls on his back, and then it ends with him, people not knowing if he's going to live or die, if he's in a coma or he is in a coma, etc. And this season picks up where that one left off. Miguel is in a coma. I believe it was for 2 weeks at least. The kid Robbie that kicked him off, which is the biological son of Johnny Lawrence, but the karate student of Daniel LaRusso, he bails. He's like on the run. People don't know where he is. A large part of this episode is, looking for him and trying to track him down. Not just the police, which were like looking for him, but, his father as well as Daniel LaRusso, which feels responsible for him and wants to, help him make the right decision and turn himself in, and, he'll do less time that way, etc. And in doing so, Daniel and Johnny are forced to like bond a bit more. At least from my perspective, in watching the show, you're seeing these two character arcs of Daniel and Johnny, seeing them from opposite perspectives that you would expect to see them as I alluded to a little earlier, where, Johnny's now the quote unquote good guy, or at least the guy that you're rooting for. And Daniel LaRusso is you're kind of seeing like in the light of being a bit of a dick, and you're not really rooting for him as much. And their arcs are like inevitably going to cross, where to a point where you start rooting for Daniel more in certain situations and understand his perspective on things, and then vice versa with Johnny. And at least as a spectator, you're like looking for them throughout this series to mend like these, what are in hindsight like petty differences that they're getting like hung up on, and then certain things that are a bit more serious, but that those petty differences from the past just like exacerbate. And when you think they get close to like mending and maybe forging some sort of relationship, like something else goes wrong. It's like, oh fuck. Then you have the storyline of Kreese, where we learn a lot more about him and his background, which is dope that this show is doing that, taking a deep dive into supporting characters like that. We find out, that he joined the army, which we knew he was in the military, but we see like flashback scenes as to why he does so, and then he's recruited to be part of these like special forces missions and stuff like that, and he's in Vietnam, and he and a few members from his crew wind up getting captured and are prisoners of war. The Vietnamese cats that took them in are like forcing them to fight to the death, like one by one. And his commanding officer didn't tell him right before they left on that mission that his girlfriend from back home had died in a car accident. And so they're like beefing back and forth now that they're all captured and stuff like that, and, facing inevitable death. And they select them two to fight each other. And right before they do, the commanding officer tells him in a very mockingly way about his girlfriend dying and stuff like that, to try to get in his head and, obviously kill him. Then they start fighting, but Kreese wins the fight. But right as he does, the platoon is like getting saved. There's like a airstrike attack from the army in that base that they were like prisoners of war. The commanding officer is like holding on like to this ledge, and at the bottom is like a pit that they're falling, the guys that lose the fight are falling into and getting fucking attacked by poisonous snakes, cobras, which is where Kreese developed the name, Cobra Kai from. Instead of Kreese like lifting him up, now that they're saved and he knows that they don't have to fight to the death, he like kicks him and, pretty much tells him to go fuck himself and die. And now Kreese is getting in the head of new students that he stole from Johnny, from the Cobra Kai that Johnny started, and, kick Johnny out. He's no longer the sensei. Kreese is brainwashing this subset of kids that didn't leave to go to either Miyagi-Do or with Johnny, that are, obviously impressionable, and he's brainwashing them the same way he did to Johnny and his crew back in the day, with this like no mercy, sweep the leg type of attitude. So you got like that whole thing going on. And what's really great also about this season, they brought back a few more characters from the movies. So you have Allie, which is the love interest. I'll tell you guys a bit about her in a second. Kumiko, which was from Karate Kid 2, the movie, when Daniel goes to Okinawa, Japan with Mr. Miyagi, and he meets that girl, which is like his love interest there. And Chosen, which is the nephew of Sato, which is the guy that Daniel winds up having to fight to the death to save Kumiko's life. And there was also a scene. I forget the girl's name, but it was like a little girl that Daniel, during a storm, climbed a tree and put her on his back and helped her down because she was like scared to come down by herself. And that girl winds up making a little cameo at the very end as well, which was pretty cool. It's dope because, Kumiko, he sees her and she shows Daniel like some letters that Mr. Miyagi had written to her mom or aunt, which was her Mr. Miyagi's like love of his life. Mr. Miyagi's writing him about Daniel and how he feels like Daniel is his family in America, and he's like the grandfather of Daniel's children, and drops some like life lesson gems which Daniel needed to hear. And then Kumiko calls Chosen to like come meet them and have lunch and stuff like that, and then leaves Chosen and Daniel together. And at first you don't know if Chosen's going to be a bad guy and, rehash this rivalry that they have, similar to kind of like Johnny back home. But they actually, Chosen and Daniel wind up like learning from each other. And Daniel finds out that there's like this whole other like facet to Miyagi-Do karate that Chosen's uncle Sato was taught by his sensei, which was the same sensei that Mr. Miyagi had. So they learned from the same sensei. But there was a more offensive approach to karate, not just defense only, but it was for the purposes of taking the ability away from your opponent that is waging war, like taking that ability away from them, which comes in handy later on in the season. Then you have Allie, which was dope the way that they brought her back into the story. She comes back to town. She's actually divorced now. She has a kid. And you think they're setting it up for some sort of setting her up as like a love interest. Not with Daniel because he's married and has 2 kids, which, by the way, Daniel's son, just to go real quick off topic, I feel like they told him they were going to like write him off the show or something. He lost like 1 million pounds. That kid was like a chunky kid in like the first couple seasons. And this season, he's just like skinny, like completely skinny. And I don't know if it was like, my wife said that, he just got older, kids when they get older and, become like teenagers or preteens or whatever, they lose like the baby fat, but I don't know. Because he's like barely on the show as is. But whatever, that's just me speculating. So now Allie's back in town and they kind of flirt with the idea of Johnny and her getting together. Like they go on this like nostalgic date to this little town fair and they're at the very end about to kiss. Like they're having a moment. The very cliche thing happens of the phone ringing and interrupting that. And up to this point, up to about like an episode or 2 before this, Johnny is single. And, Allie's the love of his life, just like Allie was like the first love of Daniel's life. And she's kind of like the one that got away. But recently, Johnny started getting involved with Miguel's mother because they live in the same complex and they had a date in an earlier season. But, with the stuff that happened to Miguel, the mother blamed Johnny because he was, the karate sensei for just like getting him involved in it. But that relationship ended when Johnny was an instrumental part in him getting back on his feet and being able to walk again. And they wind up sleeping together, etc. So, but, nothing like official. But I like the fact that they didn't make Allie the love interest. And she kind of comes into the show and becomes like the mechanism by which the rivalry and feud and tension between Daniel and Johnny finally gets mended enough for them to start seeing things eye to eye. And by the end of the final episode of the season, they set up the subsequent season, which is going to be pretty much Miyagi-Do and Eagle Fang Karate, which is the quote-unquote cool name that Johnny came up with for a new dojo. With those 2 group of, not rejects, but like the people that quote-unquote didn't hack it for Cobra Kai. They weren't like badass enough and like ruthless enough. They left and joined either Miyagi-Do or now Eagle Fang. And they decided to like team up. And the series ends with them coming together for their first joint session. Daniel and Johnny are next to each other, seeing each other as equals and as senseis of this new group of karate students that have the common goal of beating Cobra Kai in the All Valley tournament, because Kreese agreed to like a winner take all type of scenario. He said if they beat him, then he'll bounce. He'll leave town. He's gone for good. And that's going to be the theme of season 4. Oh, and with the added like tension, which this show does really well, I feel, they made now Johnny's son, which used to be Daniel's student, and he was like one of the top tier like karate guys from all the groups, is now learning under Kreese, the quote unquote bad guy, because he's pissed at Daniel for talking him into like turning himself in, and he has an estranged relationship with his father as is. So he's like, fuck you to both of them, and went to someone who was obviously eagerly willing to manipulate him and take him in and tell him what he wants to hear. And the show does that very well throughout the series in terms of introducing like tension and conflict. So definitely kudos to the writers on that. And that is Cobra Kai, streaming now on Netflix.